Today I want to talk about what happens in 6-cylinder and 4-cylinder engines, 80 horsepower and up, from the late 60s through the mid 80s. They all were inline 4s, inline 6s, and they had inner water jackets, and I want to talk about that today. The earlier engines, here's an 1100, which was just before the 125, and all it had was no inner water jacket. It had just an inner cover and then an outer cover on top of that. And when you overheated them, you'd have leakage along here and typically on the back head. On the later ones, 60s, the 800 and the 6-cylinder inlines, the 125 on up, had an inner water jacket. You can see it here on the 4-cylinder. It's got the bolts have already been removed, but it's bolted in. And then we have the 6-cylinder, which has the bolts all in it. When you overheat your engine, this is what gets affected. And before we get into showing you how the head is, I want to go through the water pumps, because that's where the action is. Most of these engines had a plastic water pump housing. The earlier ones with no inner water jacket had a metal water pump housing. This is the water pump. Was used in all of these models. It's a high pressure, low volume pump. It has very short little blades, and they are very tight, and they produce a high pressure. Unfortunately, you start this thing out of water with a plastic housing, there's no place for that heat to go. These things rubbing against the metal insert. And in less than 10 seconds, you put a pump. This is one that's been run probably no more than 20 seconds out of the water. And it's burned the edges. It melts the cup that this rides in. It melts the plastic around the cup, so it's displaced. And it melts underneath the metal plate between the water pump. You see this is the metal plate. You can see the water pump in there. It melts this as well. So we replace the upper housing, we replace all the gaskets, but we forget to replace this. Now we've got an air pocket underneath here because it's been melted and it's been squashed down. So the pump needs to have water or it doesn't work. And these pumps are really not very forgiving at all. So people start their engines out of water. Oh yeah, I just need to check it before I put it in the water. You do that, you've already started to destroy your pump. 10 seconds, you've ruined it. So you never, ever, ever start these without water. And I don't like to use the ear muffs because they slide off. Same thing happens. So I always use a plastic barrel. Anyhow, that's my comment. So what happens to these? We see the pumps, take that off, we can repair that, we can see the parts, but this is where the real damage takes place. And I'll show you what this looks like. Okay. So now we've overheated our water pump. We've overheated our engine by having a bad water pump in it, starting it up out of water, and we take it out and we run it. And the first place that gets really hit hard is the inner water jacket. It warps this piece here. I have never had any luck in surfacing these with a surface plate. I've tried it a couple of times and they always leak. So I don't I buy a new one of these, make sure this is very, very clean in here, put in a new gasket. The second place, if they're run and it's in salt water, is the corrosion. When they get overheated, they start leaking salt water, and the salt water gets in underneath the gasket, and it'll literally eat away right at the top, and pretty soon you can't put a new gasket on it. This block right here, this older block, is a perfect example of one that I had welded around because it would no longer hold a gasket. I'm not sure. I really never had much luck doing this. This one was never used. It's probably not worth even keeping, to be honest with you, even though that's all been done. But in the old days, we did a lot of rebuilding. And I saw a lot of these. We had commercially, 90% of my business was saltwater commercial fishermen. And these two blocks, the 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder blocks, were something that we sold a lot of. I got to see a lot of destruction, a lot of hours. And a couple of things that's to keep in mind when you're rebuilding one of these things. If you take off your cover, you've done a compression check, you've got even compression, you rotate your flywheel and press your rings in, and all the rings are free. The only other thing I can really recommend that needs to be done is you need to check your bottom end cap. That is, I do not take the engine apart because it's broken in, and it takes 10 hours to break them back in again, and that's a lot of running time for a lot of people, especially guys with high-speed boats. So what I do is I pull off the bottom end cap. I loosen these two bolts here, and I loosen or take these out, and then I pull this. And I can look in and I can see the reed cage and the piston and the connecting rod of the bottom cylinder, where usually most of the rust damage takes place. And I can see what kind of condition they're in. If they're in good condition, I see no reason to pull the engine apart. The second thing that goes on is in the early 80s and back, the seals were not alcohol resistant, and I'll show you what happens to them. And they need to be changed if you're doing an engine. If you look, this seal here, you can see the edge of the lip right here, and what happens, the alcohol attacks the bond between the metal and the rubber, and it generally comes unglued. I don't know if I can peel this one out here, but usually a lot of times you'll take these things out and the rubber part and the spring and the seal will be totally detached from the metal. In the later seals, they brought the rubber or the neoprene or whatever the heck it is, the sealing material, all the way, coated all the way up to the edge here, so it had a lot more adhesion. It had adhesion around the outside, and they don't tend to go anywhere near as fast. And they started using those in 83, 84. They tend to be a lot better. But you also get a chance to roll the bearing that's on the end of the crankshaft and see what kind of condition that's in too.
Now, as far as the whatever the concentration of corrosion is in all of your water jackets, there's got to be a little hidden bit of caution there too, because if you get a good layer of corrosion on anything, it's going to act like an insulator. So that water, if it's for some reason or other it's not getting the flow that it's supposed to have, and you have all of that corrosion in there that you're unaware of, you're going to probably have an overheating issue also.
All right, Matt, I will make one comment on that. I'm assuming that all the people looking at this video are smart enough to flush their engines out especially after using it in salt water, where the real problems with corrosion come on. But I run into lots of engines that are exactly like you say. They get corroded in the passages and right in here.
Right.
You can see how narrow those passages are. They could very easily clog up. Very good point. And that also will contribute to these things getting overheated and leaking. And yes, I do run into it in saltwater engines and some of the passaging in here as well.
Right.
It'll literally explode the metal.
And this just, of course, this is the outer
The outer cover, right.
And, you know, when you think about where this water has to travel, you'll have all of these passages get narrower and narrower.
Let's take a look at some of those. Very good point, Matt. Very good point. This, by the way, is Matt Watkins, who's been working on expensive foreign cars for most of his life, other than serving in the Marine Corps. And that's the big feed, but we have a small one, I do believe, right there.
Mm-hmm.
Another one right there.
There's one right here.
There's another one right there.
And there.
And there, and there. And those can all plug up, and another big one there. And then we have, in here, we have a feed down through the bottom, and another feed up top here. And these things, once they plug up, and that inner water jacket gets hot, it's done, because now you've got a leak, and you've got water on your spark plugs, and you've got an operating problem you can't fix.
And the way the water flows up into the block is it comes into the very area where the top engine cover is.
Okay.
Right? So all of these ports that we were looking at for the side cover,
Yeah.
once these get all plugged, let's say they get really restrictive,
Yep.
you're going to have a possible overheating problem also, because you're not getting the flow.
Excellent comment, Mark, Matt. Excellent. And these engines all have it, and they do need to be flushed, especially if you're operating your engine in salt water. They need to be very flushed in the fall.
And in the ones that also, have, very amounts of use. If you're just going to go out and make a few passes up and down the lake a couple times a season, I've seen a lot of the outboards that I've been into that have just sat for years, and they're nothing but a giant white crusty gob. So you never assume that everything is fine. And I always was quite resistant to take the covers off, because that usually entails broken bolts, or fasteners, I should say. And it turns into a very labor-intensive fact-finding mission. But if you're going to use the block and you're looking for longevity out of it, it's worth all the aggravation to go through those steps, especially on the earlier ones, and even some of the later ones. Corrosion is, in being exposed to military jet aircraft, corrosion was just an absolute bad thing.
Okay, I will go along that. You had a high copper content, and while you're on that subject, Mercury went to beer can aluminum in I think right around 84. And prior to that time, there was copper, because it makes aluminum a lot more ductile to machine, to cast, to do any number of things with it.
You can see that from the real older motors like KG9s, the Mark 40, all of that sand casting. Without that copper in there, the porosity of this aluminum casting that they had was atrocious. I mean, the first time they start getting any kind of corrosion, it just grows out of control.
It's internal.
It is.
Yeah, the copper ions or molecules or atoms are within the aluminum, and they corrode it. the aluminum itself corrodes to its whole thickness.
And being that is older casting, sand casting for that matter, there are a lot of imperfections. A lot.
It's come a long way.
It has. The casting technologies and some of the methods they use to cut back on that sort of thing, like coatings and things of that nature, and it just really all came down to how well they were paying attention to that metallurgy.
Well, it's changed a lot in my lifetime. I started working on these things and first went to Mercury School in '65, and we rebuilt engines. Today, we don't do that, but for you guys that are working on these 6-cylinder inlines and 4-cylinder inlines, they are still rebuildable and require internal maintenance. So hopefully this video will be of help.
I don't think that the 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder is a standalone when it comes to that sort of thing. Even the smaller 20 cubic inch, it has the same
problems.
Same
oh yeah,
problems.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the water impeller is key. It's smaller, so you really have to take care of the cooling system. If you've got, I want to say 2 years on a water impeller, that would be one of the first things you want to take and pull out and see just how this, because over time the vanes on these things will just fold over and they'll stay that way, just like this.
Perfect example.
Perfect
and
example.
pull back one of those and just show the creases on those. I do have a comment on these. You can see those develop into cracks after a while, and these blades fall off after 4 or 5 years. And I've got to say a couple of things about those impellers, those large impellers right there that we just looked at. Those were changed in '77 when Mercury came out with the Black Max V6 175. They found that that impeller had too limber a vane on it, so they went to a harder, I guess they call it a durometer of rubber, and the longevity doesn't seem to be quite as great as the older pumps, but still they need to be replaced.
I think I've been finding that too in replacing the water impellers on some of the older 4-cylinders too.
Yeah.
Years ago, you could probably take one of those impeller and stuff it down in the water pump cartridge.
Good point.
Without too much difficulty.
Very good point.
You better have some really strong muscles in your hands now, because
Yes.
that is a force to be reckoned with.
Yes.
I have to say. I mean, there are some of the Mercury outboards that they're using a much wider vane.
Yeah, that would be this model right here. This is the replacement that they went to.
And that's a piece of cake.
That's a piece of cake, and it's a high volume, low pressure pump, and it's got a metal casing which dissipates the heat. They can take a lot more abuse than the plastic mounted ones,
Right.
or even some of the earlier
And
ones.
they're stainless steel, and that keeps the corrosion down.
Yep. Yeah, they did a lot of homework and changed a lot of stuff, but we're dealing with stuff in the antique world or in the old stuff. We're vintage, excuse me, yes, vintage. We're dealing with some problems which have been pretty much eliminated. But in summation, I would like to say that if you've got one of these old engines and you've got it working well and it's running for you, would you agree with me that, like you said, inspecting that pump needs to be changed probably every couple of years if you're using it on a regular basis, and if you aren't, every time, if you leave it sit for 2 or 3 years, it definitely needs to be looked at because it's been sitting.
Yeah.
And secondly, you never, ever, ever start them up out of water, ever.
Right.
Ever.
Right.
And
the other thing that everybody, I'm pretty sure, has had to deal with this is they'll pull that water impeller out and they'll look at it, and the actual vanes will be pretty much bent over, and there's hardly any flexibility.
God forbid, you're not going to
Do
tell me to
not
put it back.
reverse it.
You're going to
Do
tell me
not
not to put it
reverse
back
it.
and backwards. Yes, do not. Absolutely.
Do
All
not.
right.
Yeah.
I've been in the business a long time, so that's such a no-no. I don't even think about it. Thank you for bringing it up. That's a very good point.
Because you will be back in there again.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Matt, and you've been a big help, and appreciate you all looking at it. Thanks. Bye.